They say every fortress hides two histories, one above ground and one below. Above, you see the stone walls, the cannons, the flags, the stories told in sunlight. But beneath lies another world. A world of silence, echoing footsteps, and secrets that were never meant to be found. Tonight, we read descending into that forgotten darkness, the hidden tunnels and secret chambers that wound beneath Europe's grandest fortresses. Some led to escape routes, others to prisons that never opened again, and a few, historians say, still wait untouched since the soldiers sealed them centuries ago. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video. It helps more curious minds find their way down here with us. And if you've ever wondered what might still lie beneath those ancient stones, tell me in the comments. Would you go down there if you had the chance? Now settle in. Slow your breathing. Let the noise of the day fade. We're going underground, where history still whispers through the walls. Every fortress in Europe has a gate that faces the world, wide, proud, guarded by towers and iron. But the oldest fortresses had another gate, one that faced inward or downward, toward the earth itself. It was never meant for visitors. It was the last door to open when the walls were falling, when the torches were burning low, and the commanders knew the enemy would come by morning. Those who built it never spoke of it loudly. They carved its arches beneath the ground, walled it in shadow, and called it simply the lower way. In the 16th and 17th centuries, when wars passed like storms across Europe, fortresses rose everywhere, on cliffs above rivers, on islands, on borders that shifted like tides. To the traveler, they looked eternal, gray stone against gray sky. But the men who built them knew better. They had seen walls crumble, gates splinter, and kings flee. They began to build not only upward but downward, carving into the earth until the fortress had roots as deep as its towers were high. Under those roots, corridors stretched like veins, winding through limestone, brick, and bedrock. Some ended in storerooms, some in wells, and some went much farther, beneath fields and forests, emerging miles away at a hidden exit known only to the commander and his mapmaker. The entrance to such a passage was rarely grand. It might be disguised as a cellar door beneath the kitchen, or a hatch behind a tapestry in the commander's hall. In one fortress near the Rhine, it was hidden beneath the floorboards of a chapel, a narrow stair curling downward into darkness, sealed with a slab of oak. To open it, you needed two keys, each kept by a different man. One was always an officer. The other was the keeper of the tunnels, a post that no soldier envied. Those keepers were half engineer, half ghost. They lived below ground, maintaining the pumps that drained the water, replacing the torches, counting the barrels of powder stored in the deep. They learned to know their world by sound rather than sight. The drip of water through stone, the murmur of air from a vent shaft, the hollow ring that warned of rot in the beams. Above them, the fortress was alive with music, orders, and laughter. Below, time moved differently. There was only the slow tick of drops falling from the ceiling and the far-off rumble of footsteps on floors they would never walk. When travelers in later centuries wrote of these places, they described the upper fortresses, the drawbridges, the ramparts, the barracks where soldiers sang at night. They rarely mentioned what lay below. But in the dusty archives of Vienna and Prague, engineers' plans still survive, drawn with fine ink on parchment. If you trace the lines carefully, you can see the other world hidden beneath. Staircases spiraling downward, chambers labeled in careful handwriting, powder room, cistern, escape way. Sometimes the lines end abruptly in blank paper, as if the draftsman had chosen not to finish what he knew. One engineer's note from 1647 reads simply, "The lower gate to be sealed by order of His Grace." No further record. The reasons for those passages were practical at first. Siege warfare demanded storage, water, and secret exits. Yet the deeper they dug, the stranger the tunnels became. Soldiers began to speak of sounds, distant hammering when no one worked, or cold air that breathed through walls of solid rock. In one Bavarian stronghold, a sentry reported hearing whispers from a wall he was repairing. The commander laughed, but when the wall was broken open years later, they found another corridor behind it, perfectly built and utterly unrecorded, leading to a sealed door that no one dared open. The fortress above was centuries old by then, but the tunnel behind that wall had never been mapped. Someone long before had built deeper than memory. To walk one of these passages now, centuries later, is to step into history's lungs. The air is heavy and cold, filled with the scent of iron and wet stone. Your footsteps echo as if the walls themselves are listening. The walls, in some places, still bear the marks of chisels, the grooves left by hands that worked by torchlight. In others, the stone has been worn smooth by the centuries, by the slow breath of air and the drift of dust. Rats and water took what the soldiers left. Candles are replaced by flashlights, maps by digital scanners, yet the feeling remains the same, that the earth is remembering. The first serious attempts to catalog these underground labyrinths came in the 19th century, when archaeologists began to explore them not as soldiers, but as scholars. They found layers of occupation, medieval brick over Roman masonry, powder magazines above ancient wells, symbols carved into corners whose meanings were long forgotten. In one fortress in modern-day Slovakia, a tunnel was discovered beneath a tunnel, a spiral descending twice as deep as any known passage. At its bottom lay a small stone chamber with a bench carved from the bedrock. No record mentioned it. Some said it was a place of prayer for the condemned. Others thought it was where the engineers rested, too far from sunlight to tell night from day. Every fortress told its own version of the same story, that in the end, defense turns inward. The walls that once looked out toward the enemy become the ceiling of a tomb. Yet in that darkness, life continued. During sieges, when fire rained from the hills, women and children were sent below. The tunnels echoed with the sounds of cooking, crying, singing. Sometimes whole weeks passed before they dared to emerge. Imagine it. The world above shaking with cannon fire, the smell of smoke seeping through the vents, the children tracing patterns in the dust by candlelight, asking when the sun would come back. For them, the hidden passages were not secret or romantic. They were home, a world between fear and survival. When peace finally came to Europe, many of the old fortresses fell into ruin. The upper walls crumbled, the gates rotted, and new cities grew around the stones. But the passages remained. Builders rediscovered them when laying foundations for houses or roads. Some were sealed again, others became cellars, wine vaults, or museums. And yet, there are still places where the entrance remains lost. Locals know only the stories, that somewhere under the fields there is a corridor you can feel if you tap the ground with a stick, that during the war, a farmer's plow vanished into a hollow and never returned. They tell these tales quietly, as though the earth might be listening. The most detailed survivor among the plans is the fortress of Renbreitstein, near Koblenz, overlooking the Rhine. Beneath its battlements lies a web of galleries so intricate that modern explorers still get lost. In some sections, staircases descend to wells hundreds of feet deep. Others lead to long, straight tunnels where the air stands perfectly still. At one corner, hidden behind a stone arch, a narrow stair ends at a heavy door banded with rusted iron. It opens inward to a space barely big enough for one person, and on the wall inside, scratched with the point of a knife, are 4 words in faded German. Were Horten Esse gekommen. We heard them coming. No date, no explanation, just the echo of fear left in iron and stone. Historians studying such marks never agree. Some see them as graffiti from frightened soldiers. Others think they were reminders left for those who would find them centuries later. Proof that even underground, people wanted to be remembered. The same impulse that built fortresses to stand forever drove their builders to dig beneath them, as if permanence required both sky and earth. Above, they fought to hold the world. Below, they tried to keep its memory safe. At night, when tours end and the lights are turned off, the silence inside those tunnels becomes complete. Guides say that if you stand still long enough, you can hear a faint rhythmic sound, like distant footsteps. It is only water, they insist, drops falling from ceiling to floor. Yet the imagination refuses to let go of the idea that the fortress still has guards below, watching the empty corridors, walking their endless watch in the dark. The air itself seems to carry their breath. To visit such a place is to understand how thin the border is between history and myth. Every fortress stands on layers of both. The hidden passages are neither wholly one nor the other. They are the space where memory hides from sunlight. When you leave them, climbing the last stair toward daylight, the air feels lighter but somehow less real. The noise of the modern world rushes in. Engines, voices, the clatter of shoes. And for a moment, it feels like waking from a long, solemn dream. Many who explore these depths say the same thing afterward. That time changes down there. Minutes stretch into hours, and centuries shrink to whispers. You begin to feel that all the people who once walked those tunnels are still close. The engineers, the keepers, the frightened families, the prisoners, even the commanders who sealed the doors behind them. Their world is gone, but its shape remains, carved in the stone beneath our feet. Perhaps that is why the story of the hidden passages never dies. They are more than architecture. They are the shadow of everything we try to protect. When the fortress above has fallen, when the flags are gone and the cannons silent, the tunnels remain, still holding their breath. They remind us that every age believes it will last forever, and every age leaves a door open to the dark, just in case. If you listen closely, beneath the hum of the present, you can almost hear it. A hinge turning, a stair creaking, a voice calling orders in a language no one speaks anymore. Somewhere below the fields of Europe, the past is still moving through its corridors, patient and unseen, waiting for the next curious soul to find the gate that leads downward. Every fortress had its master builder, but only a few had the men the records later called the architects of shadows. They were not famous, not celebrated in marble or portrait. Their names appear in margins of blueprints, in water-stained signatures at the bottom of forgotten plans. They worked by candlelight while the generals slept, shaping the veins of the fortress beneath the ground. If the ramparts above were symbols of pride, the tunnels below were exercises in fear, and fear requires a special kind of precision. To understand their craft, you must imagine Europe at the height of its sieges, the 17th century when empires collided like weather fronts. Cannon fire shattered stone that older wars had called eternal. Walls alone could no longer save a garrison. Escape and concealment became as important as defense. So the engineers turned inward, studying Earth as carefully as they once studied sky. They learned how water moved through soil, how air traveled through cracks, how sound bent around corners. They mapped darkness the way others mapped coastlines. When their drawings were finished, the surface of the fortress was only the first page. The second page was hidden, folded beneath, a network of lines that resembled routes more than corridors. The first rule of underground architecture was silence. Workers dug at night, covering the sound of their chisels with the roll of wagons above. Loose earth was carried out in barrels disguised as rubbish. Even the guards rarely knew what lay below their feet. The fewer the witnesses, the safer the secret. The second rule was deception. A single false wall might hide 3 doors, one leading nowhere, another to a pit, the last to freedom. Engineers designed confusion as carefully as they designed safety. The third rule was endurance. Whatever they built had to breathe, drain, and stand for centuries. Their craft was half mathematics, half instinct, the art of persuading stone to remember order. Many were trained under the great military engineers of their time, Vauban in France, Cohorn in the Low Countries, the Italians who carried the Renaissance habit of geometry into the mud of war. But beneath those bright schools of design, another tradition grew, the tradition of secrecy. Apprentices who worked on the lower passages were sworn to silence by oath. The formulas for ventilation shafts, the angles that kept water from flooding a stairway, these were guarded as closely as any royal cipher. Some of the oaths lasted beyond the builders' lives. A few even had their tongues buried with them, a symbol that their silence would continue underground. It might sound like legend, yet the evidence remains in stone. When modern archaeologists open a passage sealed since the 17th century, they sometimes find symbols scratched into the walls. Compasses, eyes, small triangles with dots at the center. They are not occult marks, but signatures of engineers, each one a private code indicating measurements, directions, or ownership. To the untrained eye, they look like graffiti. To the builder who carved them, they were the memory of design made permanent. Down there, where light barely reached, a symbol was a promise that reason still existed. The architects of shadows also understood psychology. They built for men who would one day be terrified, soldiers trapped by siege, prisoners waiting for ransom, commanders calculating surrender. The tunnels had to protect not just bodies but minds. Corridors were curved so that a man walking could never see too far ahead or behind, sparing him the dizziness of endless perspective. Walls were angled to carry voices softly, so that an order shouted at one end would fade before reaching the next. Some even painted ceilings white to imitate daylight, though the paint soon turned gray with smoke. The best of them thought like physicians treating the illness of fear. In their notebooks, those that survive, they wrote of the underground world with surprising tenderness. One French engineer described a passage as a vein that must not clot. Another called the air vents lungs for the buried. A German plan from 1653 lists not only the lengths of the tunnels, but the recommended number of candles per chamber, with a note: never fewer than 3, 2 for work and 1 for the soul. Such instructions blur the line between design and prayer. They were not saints. Many were harsh masters, paid in gold and Rome, driving laborers until the torches died. But even the most ruthless among them seemed aware that they were building something more lasting than any battle. When they tested their tunnels, they listened, not for noise, but for silence. If the air moved evenly, if no echo returned from the hammer's strike, the passage was sound. They measured success by absence. Centuries later, the traces of their methods still guide restoration teams. In Poland, a team exploring the fortress of Zamość found bricks laid in alternating layers of lime and sand, an ancient technique for absorbing shock from cannon fire above. In the Czech town of Terezin, engineers discovered entire drainage systems hidden within the outer walls, invisible until the plaster was removed. The more they looked, the more they realized that the fortress was not a single building, but two worlds folded together, the visible and the buried. The second was often more elegant than the first. What drove these men to carve beauty where no sunlight would ever touch it? Some said pride, the desire to prove mastery even over darkness. Others believed it was humility, an acknowledgement that true endurance hides from glory. Whatever the reason, they left a landscape that still breathes beneath Europe's fields. In certain winters, when frost pulls moisture through old vents, you can see thin plumes of vapor rising from the ground like ghosts exhaling. The locals call them the sighs of the fortress. They are the breath of forgotten architecture. Not all of the architects survived their work. Collapse was common. Air ran out. Fires consumed whole crews. There are accounts of rescue parties finding tools lying neatly beside unfinished walls, the men gone, the rock unbroken, as if the earth had closed its mouth after swallowing them. Yet, even these tragedies became part of the design. Later builders carved niches into corridors where lamps could burn longer and added small bells near entrances to signal if air stopped flowing. Every loss became a lesson. One of the last and most mysterious of these engineers was a man named Lorenzo Tagli, who worked in northern Italy around 1710. His signature appears on only 3 documents, but his tunnels are found beneath at least 6 fortresses. They share an unusual feature, a central chamber shaped like a circle from which 4 corridors extend like compass points. Each corridor slopes upward by exactly the same degree, leading eventually to a hidden exit at ground level. No one knows why he favored this design. Some scholars think it represented balance. Others, escape in all directions. The peasants who later explored them simply called the place Il Cor di Pietra, the heart of stone. In the center of one such chamber, carved into the floor, is a single Latin phrase, quod supra, infra, what is above is below. It was as close to a confession as any engineer ever left. When the age of gunpowder ended and the wars moved on, the craft of subterranean building faded. The new architects built palaces and museums, trading torches for skylights. But somewhere in their blueprints, the old instinct remained, the need to balance what can be seen with what must be hidden. Even the great train tunnels of the 19th century owe something to those earlier minds. Every shaft of modern engineering has a little of the fortress beneath it, a little of the fear that built safety through secrecy. Today, when archaeologists crawl through the surviving tunnels, they carry lights brighter than the sun to the eyes of their predecessors. They record every wall, every symbol, every bend. Yet as they work, they often fall silent, as if speaking would disturb the geometry of the place. The acoustics remain so perfect that a whisper travels farther than expected. Some report hearing their own echoes return with a delay, so long it feels like another voice answering. Whether imagination or physics, it leaves the same impression, that the builders are still there, somewhere in the pattern, listening. If you stand in one of those passages long enough, you begin to sense the logic that shaped it. The curves are never random. The widths breathe like sentences with commas and pauses. Even without drawings, you can feel the grammar of the architecture. It teaches patience. The longer you remain, the more the world above fades until you can no longer tell whether the rumble you hear is thunder or memory. Then, for a heartbeat, you understand what those architects knew, that security and mystery are twins, and every wall hides the echo of its own making. When you finally climb back to the surface, blinking in daylight, the ordinary sounds of the world, wind, birds, voices, feel almost too loud. The fortress above looks smaller than it did before. You realize that the true monument is not the stones that catch the sun, but the spaces that hold its absence. That is the legacy of the architects of shadows, to build places where silence itself could live, where fear could be tamed by order, and where the memory of war could rest in peace beneath the feet of the living. And so, as the evening settles over the old citadels and the last visitors leave, the hidden world below keeps its quiet vigil. The air moves softly through vents designed 4 centuries ago. Dust drifts down staircases once meant for escape. Somewhere, behind a wall that no one has opened since the time of kings, a small symbol still waits in the dark. A compass, an eye, a promise that reason endures even where the sun does not. The architects of shadows are gone, but their geometry remains, holding the weight of history in perfect silence. And if you ever find yourself walking the stones of an ancient fortress at night, pause and listen. Beneath your footsteps, under layers of earth and time, their designs are still there, quietly keeping watch, reminding the world that every stronghold has a secret heart. Every fortress has 2 kinds of silence, the one that follows battle and the one that never ends. It is the second that clings to the underground cells, the heavy, breathing silence that belonged to those who lived where daylight could not reach. For the prisoners of Europe's fortresses, time was not measured by clocks or seasons, but by the rhythm of footsteps above their heads. When the century changed shift, when the bells rang for morning drills, The echoes told them what hour it must be. Otherwise, the days were colorless, and the nights had no beginning. At first, the tunnels had not been meant for captives. They were passages for escape or storage, built by the engineers who believed that war could be organized like mathematics. But the deeper the tunnels went, the more they tempted commanders to use them for other purposes. A room without windows, a stair that no enemy could find, a door that led nowhere. All of these were invitations to secrecy. And secrecy, in an age of treachery and rebellion, meant imprisonment. By the late 16th century, many fortresses had begun to include small, windowless chambers in their foundations, so small that the architects did not bother to give them names. In the plans they are labeled simply vaults or stores, yet the marks of shackles can still be seen on their walls. In some, the rings are set high, as if for chains that hung from the ceiling. In others, they are low, built for the ankles of men who sat in darkness for months. The air in these rooms was thin and damp. A single vent shaft, carved as narrow as an arm, provided breath enough to keep a man alive but never comfortable. Above, life in the fortress continued. Drills, orders, laughter. Below, the prisoners listened to it as to a memory from another world. Most of the men sent there were not traitors or spies. They were deserters, thieves, debtors, sometimes political prisoners, people inconvenient to their rulers, but not important enough to execute. To send them below was cheaper than trial, safer than mercy. A few were kept as hostages, insurance for peace treaties that might never come. One record from a fortress near Lille describes a nobleman's servant held underground for 23 years because his master owed money to the crown. His name appears once, then disappears, replaced by a note in another hand. No longer requires provisions. That is all. For those who survived long enough to write or carve, the tunnels became both prison and diary. Scratched into the walls of dozens of cells across Europe are messages written in Latin, French, Italian, Czech, and languages now forgotten. Some are prayers, some are curses, a few are simple counts of days. Vi tenebris, septem mensis. In darkness, 7 months. Others are pictures, crosses, hearts, ships, and sometimes faces drawn so delicately that the stone seems almost human. The guards, accustomed to these marks, rarely erased them. They understood that the act of carving kept the prisoners sane. Every stroke of the stone was a heartbeat measured against silence. Food arrived once a day, passed through small hatches in the doors. The guards were careful never to look directly inside. They feared the eyes staring back at them, feared pity more than rebellion. Water was lowered in buckets through the same openings. Sometimes it was clean, sometimes not. Rats thrived in the damp. The prisoners learned to listen to their footsteps as a form of company. In winter, when the upper halls froze, the underground stayed the same. A steady chill that numbed but did not kill. In summer, it was almost cool, and the guards envied it. The irony was cruel. The deeper the cell, the steadier the temperature, the longer a man could survive. The fortress fed its shadows slowly. Stories spread among the soldiers about what happened below. Some believed the tunnels were haunted, that the groans and knocks heard at night were not prisoners but ghosts of earlier wars. Commanders encouraged such rumors. Fear kept curiosity away from forbidden doors. Yet occasionally a new recruit would get lost during rounds and stumble upon a cell he had never seen before. The shock of hearing a voice call from the dark, a voice that knew his language but spoke it with the weight of decades, was enough to send him running. Afterward, he might tell the story at the tavern, swearing that the man inside could not have been alive. Historians studying these accounts often try to separate fact from legend, but the truth lies in the materials themselves. The tunnels were built to muffle sound, to bend it around corners. A shout in one chamber could echo days later in another as a faint whisper. Those who heard voices might have been hearing their own fear reflected through stone. Or perhaps not. The underground has its own acoustics, its own kind of memory. Sound lingers there the way light lingers on the surface of water, shimmering long after its source is gone. Some fortresses kept records of their captives, others erased them. In Salzburg, the fortress of Hohensalzburg still has a narrow corridor called the Chain Gallery. Along one side are small alcoves, each large enough for a man to stand but not to sit. The chains fixed inside are iron, rusted into the color of dried blood. Guides tell visitors that they were used for deserters during the wars of the early 18th century. At the far end, a small hole in the wall opens into the main drain, leading down to the river. The prisoners called it the window. Through it they heard the sound of running water, and some said that hearing it kept them alive. Others found it unbearable, proof that freedom existed only a few feet away. In Bohemia, beneath the fortress of Spielberg, records describe a cell reserved for silent prisoners. These were men who knew secrets too valuable to risk in conversation. They were chained alone, forbidden to speak even to their guards. The rule was enforced by the design of the cell itself. The door was double-walled, and food was delivered through a sliding drawer so that no words could pass. When one such prisoner was found dead in 1752, the officer in charge wrote a single sentence in the log. He died without noise. Centuries later, tourists walk past that same door and remark on its thickness. They do not know that it was built to protect words from escaping. Not all who entered those depths were men. In certain fortresses along the Baltic, women accused of espionage or witchcraft were confined below ground while waiting for transfer to civil courts. Their names survive only because the fortress quartermasters charged extra for the candles used in their cells. One ledger reads, "For the woman in the lower room, 3 candles, 2 days." No verdict follows. Candlelight was their last witness. Yet even in those conditions, life found small victories. Prisoners grew mold into shapes of flowers on their walls, polished pebbles into charms, tamed rats as pets. They counted footsteps of guards to mark the hours. Some sang quietly, old songs remembered from childhood, their voices so soft that they blended with the hum of air through the vents. Guards pretended not to hear. In a few rare cases, friendships formed, letters smuggled, food shared, secrets exchanged through cracks in the stone. The fortress may have been designed for obedience, but humanity has its own architecture. When peace returned and the fortresses became museums, the curators found themselves inheriting not just walls, but stories. Visitors now walk through those same cells with cameras and flashlights. The air smells of dust and lime, the same scent that once clung to the prisoners' clothes. Guides speak softly out of respect, though the prisoners would never have heard voices so gentle. On the walls, the carvings remain. A heart pierced by an arrow, a date, a name, Anton, 1703. The guides point them out, the visitors nod, and then the group moves on, leaving the name behind once more. The prisoner is remembered for a heartbeat, then forgotten again, as if history itself still rehearses the rhythm of captivity. There are fortresses where the cells are too dangerous to enter, flooded, collapsed, or filled with carbon dioxide from underground decay. They remain sealed, their contents untouched. Archaeologists call them black chambers, not for color, but for uncertainty. They lie like unopened letters in the earth, preserving whatever remains of those who lived and died there. One day they may be opened, but perhaps it is better if they are not. Some histories prefer their silence. The prisoners who lived below the light never wrote books. Their words survive only in the texture of stone, in the grooves where fingernails once pressed, in the fragments of bone found when new foundations are laid. Yet their presence lingers more vividly than that of kings or generals. Above ground, the fortress was the language of power. Below, it was the language of endurance. The men and women who breathed that damp air taught the walls to hold memory, to echo compassion in the dark. If you stand in one of those cells today and turn off your light, the blackness feels alive. It presses gently against your skin like water. You hear the distant heartbeat of the world above, traffic, footsteps, voices, and then, slowly, they fade. The air grows thicker. Your own breath becomes the only movement. And in that moment, you understand why the prisoners carved their names, why they whispered prayers to unseen ceilings. They wanted to be found, not rescued, but remembered. To live below the light was to live at the edge of forgetfulness, and carving a single line in the wall was enough to keep existence real. When you emerge again, blinking at the daylight, you carry a small piece of that darkness with you. It settles quietly in the mind, a reminder that the walls we build to keep others in can also hold our history safe. The fortresses of Europe still stand, their stones warmed by centuries of sunlight, but their souls remain below, where time is slow, the air is heavy, and every sound is a heartbeat echoing through stone. Long before wires carried words, before radios turned whispers into waves, there were the messengers who moved through the veins of the earth. They belonged to no single army or nation. Some were soldiers, some were servants, some were prisoners with a bargain to make. They carried what no fortress could ever fully contain: information. And in the long corridors beneath Europe's fortresses, information was as dangerous as gunpowder. Every war produces two kinds of communication: those that are meant to be heard, and those that are not. Trumpets and cannons speak the first kind, open and loud. The second kind hides in silence. Folded papers, coded words, footsteps in the dark. The tunnels were built for movement, but they became something else, an invisible network that joined the living and the lost, the loyal and the betrayed. When the fortress gates were closed and the walls above trembled under bombardment, the tunnels below became the only way the world could still speak to itself. The first messengers were not professionals. They were whoever knew the tunnels best: the engineers, the water bearers, the guards who carried lanterns through the lower galleries. During sieges, when the fortress was surrounded and cut off, these men slipped through hidden doors to carry orders to nearby villages or allies waiting in the hills. They knew every turn, every echo, every step that creaked differently underfoot. Some never returned. The tunnels might flood, or collapse, or fill with smoke from the fires above. But those who did come back brought news that kept the fortress alive. In times of isolation, rumor itself became sustenance. Over time, commanders began to formalize this hidden communication. They drew maps with dotted lines showing escape routes and whisper roads. They trained small groups of runners, men chosen for their steady nerves and small stature, for the ability to crawl through spaces where others could barely breathe. The French called them les taupes, the moles. The Austrians had die Schattenläufer, the shadow runners. They were armed not with weapons, but with sealed packets of parchment wrapped in wax. Each packet carried either coordinates, supply requests, or, sometimes, only a single sentence meant to confirm that the fortress still stood. It was never the content that mattered most, but the contact. To receive a message was to know you were not alone. In the fortress of Königstein, high above the Elbe, the tunnels that wound beneath its base became known as the Silent Roads. During one siege in the early 18th century, a single messenger named Jacob Grunwald was sent out through them to reach Dresden with news of dwindling supplies. He left before dawn and returned 3 days later with nothing but a small loaf of bread and a note written in candle smoke on cloth: "Hold." Reinforcements moved by river. He had hidden in drainage shafts, crawled past enemy camps, and followed the sound of distant church bells to find his way. The message was only 5 words long, but it bought the garrison another week of courage. That was often enough. The tunnels also carried other kinds of messages, those not written by generals, but whispered by the condemned. In the lower cells, where prisoners were kept, communication was forbidden. Yet human minds find ways to speak even when tongues cannot. Prisoners tapped on walls, 3 knocks for yes, 2 for no. They used pebbles to carve symbols that only they understood. When guards passed, they went silent, then resumed when the footsteps faded. A network of unseen conversations spread through the stone, fragile but persistent. In one fortress near Antwerp, archaeologists later discovered a sequence of holes drilled between neighboring cells, tiny as quills, through which prisoners could murmur to one another. One of them, judging by a scratch nearby, had carved the word brother. Not all messages were human. Pigeons were kept in cages, even underground, trained to fly through ventilation shafts. Their small metal canisters carried words lighter than air, but heavier than hope. When released through the upper vents, they spiraled up into sunlight, a living bridge between shadow and sky. The practice was risky. Enemies often shot at them, and storms scattered their routes. Yet enough survived to make it worthwhile. One report from 1794 mentions a pigeon that returned to a besieged fortress carrying a feather from another bird attached to its leg, proof that it had met its companion in flight, two couriers crossing invisible lines above a continent at war. But the most elusive messengers were the spies. They used the tunnels not to connect comrades, but to deceive them. Some carried false maps, others letters written in sympathetic ink that could only be read under heat. A few were double agents, hired by both sides, paid twice to say nothing. The tunnels suited them perfectly. Their darkness equalized all faces. You could pass a stranger there and never know which flag he served. In such places, loyalty was measured not by words, but by silence. One famous incident occurred in 1706 beneath the fortress of Lille, where a network of mining tunnels connected opposing camps. Both armies had engineers digging toward each other, listening through the earth for signs of enemy movement. At some point, the two tunnels met. The first man to break through expected combat. Instead, he found himself staring at another miner holding a candle. Neither spoke. They simply backed away, sealed their ends of the passage, and reported nothing. The generals never learned that for one brief moment, enemies had shared the same pocket of air, breathing the same silence. In the dark, identity loses its armor. Messages carried through the tunnels did not always move in one direction. Rumors flowed back. News of victories, defeats, betrayals, all distorted by distance and fear. By the time a runner returned to the fortress, his story might have changed 3 times, reshaped by exhaustion and hope. The commanders understood this, yet they preferred rumor to emptiness. In the cold logic of siege, belief was a weapon. If men believed that help was coming, then it existed, if only for another day. The architecture itself aided this strange commerce. Many tunnels had echo points, curved junctions where sound could travel long distances. Guards stationed at these points could whisper to one another across hundreds of meters. Later, engineers formalized this phenomenon, calling it acoustic relay. Some fortresses even installed small brass cones in the walls to amplify the effect. Long before microphones and telephones, these were the first crude instruments of subterranean speech. When modern restorers tested them, they found that a whisper spoken clearly at one end could be heard half a kilometer away. The voice of the past still travels farther than expected. And then there were the accidental messengers, the water that seeped through walls, carrying traces of ink and ash, the smoke that drifted through vents, telling of fires above, the rats that dragged scraps of letters from one corridor to another. Even decay communicates. In an Austrian fortress, restorers found parchment fragments stuck to the ceiling of a drainage channel. When cleaned, the fragments revealed a map drawn upside down, perhaps dropped by a messenger crawling through and reattached by moisture. The map showed not the fortress itself, but the river and hills beyond, a reminder that every secret longs for the open world. When peace finally came and the fortresses turned into museums, the idea of underground communication became something almost romantic. Guides told stories of brave runners and faithful pigeons. Children listened wide-eyed. Yet the reality had been less heroic and more human. The tunnels carried not just orders, but emotions: fear, loneliness, determination. Each message was a heartbeat struggling through stone, an attempt to bridge isolation. In that sense, the messengers were not only servants of war, they were guardians of connection. They kept alive the fragile thread of voice that ties one soul to another, even when the walls are thick and the world above forgets. Modern researchers studying these passages often remark on their strange acoustics. Some tunnels amplify the smallest sound, others swallow noise completely. A footstep can vanish mid-echo. Scientists attribute it to irregular geometry, but the effect feels almost spiritual, as if the tunnels decide which words to remember. In a fortress near Namur, sound tests revealed that certain frequencies lingered for several seconds longer than others, specifically those that matched the average pitch of a human whisper. It is a coincidence, perhaps. Or perhaps the walls have learned to hold onto the sound of speech, the same way they hold the scent of iron and dust. Today, when visitors walk those corridors with electric lights, they sometimes feel a sudden chill or hear faint murmurs that seem to move ahead of them. Guides explain that it's the wind passing through cracks, but the feeling remains, the impression that someone has just delivered a message and vanished around the corner. The tunnels make listeners of everyone. Down there, you cannot help but lower your voice, as though afraid to interrupt a conversation centuries old. If you listen long enough, you begin to sense the rhythm that once guided the messengers. The pause before a corner, the cautious breath before climbing, the soft brush of cloth against stone. The darkness teaches you to move with intention, to let your heartbeat replace your compass. You start to understand how a man could navigate miles of passage without losing his way, not by sight, but by memory, by counting turns as if reciting a prayer. The last known use of a fortress tunnel for secret communication came during the early years of the 20th century. A group of soldiers stationed at a Renbreitstein reportedly used an old drainage channel to send notes between barracks after curfew. When discovered, they were reprimanded, but their notes were preserved. One reads simply, "The watch sleeps tonight." Another says, "Sing softly. The walls carry sound." Even in peace, the instinct to speak through darkness remains. The messengers of the tunnels have long vanished, their paths sealed or forgotten, but their legacy endures. Every whisper that travels through modern cables, every signal that moves unseen beneath the ground, is a descendant of their courage. They prove that communication does not require light, only distance, patience, and faith that someone is listening. The walls heard them once, perhaps they still do. If you ever find yourself walking through a fortress at night, pause when you reach a stairway that descends. Listen to the air. Somewhere below, the echo of footsteps still travels, carrying a message whose words have long since dissolved, but whose meaning remains unchanged. We are still here. The tunnels remember, even when the world above forgets. Before the modern world learned to fight wars with machines and distance, soldiers slept almost within the earth itself. Beneath the fortresses that crown Europe's hills and riverbanks, where damp air pressed against the walls like the breath of the planet, men once dreamed in stone chambers lit by torches and oil lamps. They were not prisoners, though their rooms might look like cells. They were the garrison, the heartbeat of the fortress, and for many, the tunnels below were the only home they would ever know. When night fell, the fortress above them changed character. The noise of drills, of commands shouted across courtyards, slowly faded until only the wind and the watch bell remained. Then, down the narrow stairways, soldiers descended to rest. Some carried blankets or lanterns. Others simply followed the man in front of them, trusting the rhythm of his footsteps to guide the way. The air grew cooler with each step. The smell of damp mortar replaced that of gunpowder and smoke. And soon they reached the sleeping quarters, a maze of low rooms carved into the earth, lined with bunks of rough wood and straw. It is difficult now to imagine how life existed there, between battle and stone. Each chamber might hold 50 men, sometimes more, the ceiling low enough that the tallest had to stoop. Candles burned in iron brackets, their light trembling against the walls. The air shimmered faintly with moisture. The only sounds were the slow drip of water from the ceiling and the distant thud of boots from the night watch above. Some soldiers spoke quietly. Others lay awake staring into the dark, tracing the cracks in the roof with their eyes. For those few hours of rest, the world shrank to the space between one heartbeat and the next. The design of those underground barracks was practical. The earth above them shielded against cannon fire, and their narrow corridors prevented explosions from spreading. Yet in their practicality, there was also a strange intimacy. Men lived shoulder to shoulder, hearing each other breathe. Privacy did not exist. Sleep was a shared condition. The same air passed from one mouth to another, and dreams seemed to drift like smoke from bunk to bunk. When one man coughed, the sound became a chorus. When one laughed in his sleep, the others smiled in the dark. The fortress above them might be built for war, but down there, for a few hours each night, it felt almost like a monastery, a brotherhood bound not by faith, but by fatigue. Every fortress had its keeper of the lower quarters, usually an older soldier no longer fit for battle. He carried keys on a ring so heavy it left marks on his belt. His duty was to walk the corridors before dawn, counting heads by the flicker of a lantern. If a man had died in the night, which happened more often than anyone admitted, the keeper would cover him with his own cloak and wait until the bell for morning muster before reporting it. Death below was quiet. It came without ceremony. A cough, a sigh, then stillness. The body would be carried up when the first light reached the gate, when the fortress returned to sound and sunlight. The soldiers learned to tell time without clocks. They knew the hour by the smell of the air, cold and metallic before dawn, heavier by evening. When the walls sweated more than usual, they knew rain was coming, even if they could not see the sky. The fortress itself became a kind of calendar, its stones keeping rhythm with the seasons. In winter, frost crept along the arches like lace. In summer, bats circled the torches, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp straw. Above them, life might have followed the pattern of the sun, but below, time obeyed the slow pulse of the earth. Despite the darkness, life in those quarters was not entirely grim. Soldiers found ways to make the tunnels theirs. They carved initials into the bunks, hung bits of cloth from nails, drew plain boards on the floor in charcoal. When rations were good, they toasted with tin cups, and the sound of laughter echoed up the stairways like birdsong trapped underground. Some even sang quietly before sleep, folk songs from villages they would never see again, lullabies remembered from childhood. The acoustics of stone made their voices sound both near and infinite, as if the fortress itself were singing back to them. For new recruits, hearing those songs for the first time was both comforting and haunting. It meant they were now part of something larger than themselves, a lineage of men who slept in the dark so that others could dream in peace above. There were superstitions, of course. Every garrison had its own. Some believed that if a candle burned too brightly at midnight, a man from their room would die in the next battle. Others said that the fortress breathed, that when its air grew suddenly warm, it meant a storm or attack was coming. They whispered about the tunnels beneath the lower barracks, the ones sealed and forgotten. On sleepless nights, a few claimed to hear footsteps down there, too slow for rats, too steady for wind. The older soldiers only smiled and told them to keep their heads covered. Fear, they said, was another kind of guard duty. It kept you alert. Food came down the same way as orders, through narrow stairways and wooden lifts operated by pulleys. The smell of boiled grain or salted meat often reached the lower chambers before the men did. They ate from shared pots, their spoons clinking in rhythm. Water was fetched from wells dug deep into the rock, cool and slightly bitter. The cook fires were placed near air vents so that smoke could escape. Even so, the walls absorbed it, leaving behind a scent that no cleaning could remove. Centuries later, visitors still smell that faint mixture of ash and sweat and iron. the perfume of a vanished army. In peacetime, the underground barracks became workshops. Soldiers mended weapons, made rope, repaired uniforms. Some carved small objects from bone, dice, combs, even miniature cannons. They traded them for favors or kept them as talismans. A few of these trinkets survive in museums today, their surfaces polished smooth by countless hands. To touch them is to feel the pulse of ordinary life hidden beneath centuries of stone. What dreams filled the minds of those who slept below the earth? We cannot know, but their letters hint at longing more than fear. One soldier wrote to his sister from a fortress near Verona, "Down here, the world feels made of breathing. We sleep as if buried, yet every morning we rise again." Another, stationed in Belgium, described hearing thunder through the walls and thinking it was the sea. These men lived so close to the earth that even nature's sounds arrived distorted, translated into the language of echo. There were moments of tenderness too. When one soldier fell ill, the others took turns fanning him with scraps of paper to keep the air moving. They shared water, covered each other's blankets when supplies ran low. The lower quarters taught them an equality that the parade ground never could. Rank mattered less in the dark. Once the lamps were extinguished, everyone looked the same, faces lit only by the glow of memory and fear. In that anonymity, friendship grew like moss on stone, slow, patient, unspoken. During sieges, when cannon fire shook the walls above, the men slept fully dressed, boots on, weapons beside them. Dust fell from the ceiling in fine gray rain. They learned to read the explosions by their sound. The distant booms were from the enemy, the sharp cracks from their own guns. Sometimes the noise was so constant that even in moments of silence they still heard it, echoing inside their skulls like a phantom drum. In those times, dreams and waking became one. A man might dream of battle and wake to find it still happening above him. Sleep became an act of defiance, proof that life could continue even under siege. When peace finally arrived and the fortresses lost their purpose, many of those chambers were sealed. Grass grew over the vents, and the world forgot that men had once slept there. But some were rediscovered by accident, builders digging foundations, archaeologists following old maps. Inside, they found straw turned to dust, wooden bunks collapsed into fragments, and sometimes, still nailed to the wall, a small piece of metal shaped like a heart. These relics speak more softly than monuments, but they endure. They remind us that history is not only written in victories, but also in the quiet persistence of those who waited. Modern visitors walking through restored fortresses sometimes pause at the entrances to these lower quarters. The guides speak softly, as if the soldiers might still be sleeping. The air feels cooler, the floor uneven, the ceiling low enough to make one bow. In the glow of electric lamps, the stone looks almost alive, shimmering slightly, as if breathing. You can imagine the rows of men lying there, boots at their feet, hands folded on their chests, dreaming of sunlight they had not seen for days. The hum of distant traffic replaces the old drumbeats of war, but the atmosphere remains. The earth remembers the rhythm of their rest. Perhaps that is why these places still draw people. They are reminders that history was not only fought, it was endured. The soldiers who slept below the earth did not seek glory. They sought morning. Every time they woke and climbed the stair toward the courtyard, they carried with them the scent of stone and the patience of the underground. Their courage was quiet, measured not in victories, but in the simple act of rising again. If you listen closely, standing in one of those tunnels, you can almost hear them still. The murmur of conversation, the rustle of straw, the sigh of someone turning in sleep. The fortress above may have become a monument, but below, in the heart of the earth, the soldiers are still resting, eternal, unbothered, keeping their watch through dreams. Every fortress begins not with stone, but with silence. The silence before the first hammer strikes, before the dust rises, before the echo of men's voices fills the air. In that silence lie the names of those who will never be remembered. The builders. They arrived before the generals, before the flags, before history had a reason to take notice. They shaped the bones of Europe's fortresses, carving their own lives into the foundations. And when the walls were finished, many of them stayed behind, not by choice, but by accident, by collapse, by the quiet swallowing of earth and time. They were the ones who built the world and were buried inside it. To imagine their work is to imagine patience turned to stone. The armies that would one day live above them fought for months, maybe years. The builders labored for decades. They came from villages where the soil was thin and the hunger deep. Some were masons, some were diggers, some simply strong enough to lift what others could not. They came with hands already rough and backs already bent, and they traded sunlight for wages. Their world was a rhythm: hammer, breath, silence. The sound of chisels striking limestone became a language of its own, echoing through caverns that no one above ever saw. At dawn, they descended into the tunnels, carrying their tools and lanterns. The light from the surface followed them only a little way, then faded into orange haze. The walls were damp, sometimes dripping, sometimes dry as bone. They dug by hand, cutting channels for air and water, testing the stone with their ears. A hollow sound meant danger, a dull sound meant safety. They learned to tell the difference faster than any engineer. Every strike of the hammer was both creation and risk. Sometimes a single misjudged blow could bring down an entire section, burying men where they stood. The overseers kept records, lists of materials, weights, and costs, but rarely names. A builder could disappear from the tally and be replaced the next day without ceremony. A note in an Austrian fortress ledger from 1681 reads, "2 carts of lime delivered. 1 man missing. Shift continues." No more detail than that. The walls of Europe rose from sentences like that one: short, practical, final. To survive underground, the men invented their own rituals. Before beginning a new tunnel, they would mark the entrance with chalk, a simple circle crossed by a line, to warn the earth that they meant no harm. They spoke softly while working, believing that loud voices could wake something sleeping in the stone. At the end of the day, when they climbed back toward the surface, they touched the wall with the tips of their fingers, a gesture of respect, like saying goodnight. Even in exhaustion, they treated the tunnels as living beings, creatures of patience and weight. Many of them never saw the fortresses completed. When war came, construction halted, and the soldiers moved in. The diggers and masons were sent away or, in some cases, pressed into service as engineers. They knew the labyrinths better than anyone, so they became guides for those who fought in them. Some died carrying gunpowder to the lower chambers. Others vanished during bombardments, buried when ceilings caved in. Centuries later, their remains were sometimes found by archaeologists, bones mixed with tools, a lantern still beside them, as if they had simply paused to rest. The records called these discoveries human elements, but they were more than that. They were the heartbeat that kept the walls alive. The deeper tunnels were the most dangerous. Air grew thin, candles flickered, and the smell of sulfur and sweat mixed into something sharp. The men there worked in pairs, never alone. One dug while the other listened. They could hear the mountain groaning, the low vibration of stress moving through the rock. When it grew too loud, they stopped and waited for the sound to fade. Sometimes it didn't. Those were the moments when the earth decided to take back what it had lent. A shift, a crack, a rush of air, and then silence, final and complete. The survivors would stand still for a long time, heads bowed, before sealing the passage and moving on. No one dared dig back. It was said that disturbing the dead below would anger the structure above. Over time, their craft became a secret language of geometry and endurance. They built walls that breathed, ceilings that carried weight like shoulders bearing burdens. They learned how to curve an arch so that pressure flowed like water, how to carve drains that sang faintly when wind passed through them. Their skill was invisible, but it made survival possible. Every fortress that still stands owes its strength to men who never saw daylight. And yet, for all their knowledge, they left few marks of themselves. A name scratched into mortar here, a thumbprint frozen in clay there, small defiance against anonymity. In some fortresses, you can still find those prints, half-worn by time, but still human enough to feel like a handshake across centuries. Legends grew around them. Peasants told stories of builders walled alive as sacrifices, sealed into chambers to bless the fortress with loyalty. Historians dismissed these tales, calling them metaphors for dedication, but the truth is less dramatic and more poignant. Many did die within the walls, not by ritual, but by accident, and superstition turned loss into legend. One story from Poland tells of a mason who fell into a newly poured foundation. His companions searched, but could not find him. They left a small cross carved above the spot, and for decades afterward, soldiers touched it for luck before going into battle. Whether or not his body remained there no longer mattered. The wall had taken him, and the fortress had remembered. The builders' lives were harsh, but strangely proud. They worked without glory, but they knew that their creations would outlive them. When they looked up at the massive arches of the halls they'd carved, they saw not imprisonment, but triumph. Proof that even in darkness, human hands could shape order. Some of them could not bear to leave. When construction ended, they stayed on as caretakers or cellar guards. They slept in the same chambers they had built, surrounded by the sound of their own work. In a few places, records mention men who refused to go back to the surface, saying that the light hurt their eyes or that the silence below was more peaceful. They became part of the fortress, shadows among the stones. Centuries later, explorers still find traces of their presence. A tool left leaning against a wall, a wooden beam cut with initials, the remains of a small campfire buried under debris. In one fortress near Vienna, restorers uncovered a sealed passage that led to a chamber filled with tools arranged neatly along the floor. There were no bones, no sign of panic, only an unfinished wall, and, beside it, a single word scratched into the plaster: Morgan. Tomorrow. Perhaps they meant to return. Perhaps they never could. It is strange to think that the most enduring monuments of civilization were built by those who own nothing. They carved the very ground into order, yet their graves were unmarked. Their wages spent long before the First War ever tested their work. The generals wrote their names in books. The builders wrote theirs in stone dust. Time has kept one set of names and scattered the other, yet the walls remember all of them equally. Every echo in those tunnels, every tremor when footsteps fall, is a kind of acknowledgement. In some fortresses, guides tell visitors that if you stand still in the lowest chamber and whisper, the walls will answer. They say you can hear the faint tap of tools still striking in rhythm, the ghost of construction continuing beneath the centuries. Scientists call it acoustics, locals call it gratitude. Either way, it is the sound of persistence, the earth quietly thanking those who shaped it. To walk those corridors now is to walk through their memories. The surfaces are uneven, marked by the hesitation of hands long gone. The ceilings bear soot from torches extinguished hundreds of years ago. The air is cooler than the world above, and it tastes faintly of iron. Every sense tells you that you are standing inside something both human and eternal. These were not just walls for defense. They were acts of faith in the idea that structure could resist chaos. The builders believed in that with every breath they took, even when the earth itself turned against them. When you leave the tunnels and climb into daylight, blinking at the brilliance of the sky, it is easy to forget that somewhere beneath your feet, another sky once existed, a sky of stone and dust, under which men lived, worked, and sometimes vanished. The fortresses still stand, their towers proud against the clouds, but their true foundations are made not of rock, but of lives. The builders are gone, their voices lost, their names erased. Yet their work endures, whispering upward through every brick. reminding us that even silence has architects. And so the story of the fortresses is not only about kings or battles or strategy. It is also about the quiet endurance of those who built them, whose blood mixed with mortar, whose bones became part of the foundation, whose touch can still be felt if you run your hand along the wall. They vanished beneath their own walls, yes, but in doing so, they ensured that the walls themselves would never vanish. The earth holds their memory more faithfully than any book. If you listen, you can still hear them. The echo of hammer on stone, faint but steady, somewhere in the distance where sound becomes history and history becomes rest. They are still building, in a way, shaping the silence that fills the fortresses at night, keeping them standing through the centuries. The soldiers may have left, the flags may have changed, but the builders remain. And the world above, unaware, continues to walk upon their work, upon their patience, their precision, and their quiet surrender to time. Every fortress was built to keep something out, but most also kept something in. Not all secrets were written in ink. Some were carved into walls, sealed behind stones, or whispered into the dark before being forgotten on purpose. Over the centuries, Europe's fortresses became more than military strongholds. They became vaults of memory, where history stored the things it was not ready to face. Beneath their towers and courtyards, beneath the polished museums they have become today, lie rooms that were never meant to be opened. The first secret a fortress learned to keep was its own design. The blueprints of great strongholds were guarded like royal treasures. Only a handful of engineers ever saw the complete plan. Maps of the lower tunnels were copied by hand, locked in iron chests, and destroyed when the builders died. Even today, restorers sometimes find corridors that appear in no archive. One engineer's diary from the 1600s contains a single sentence, a passage drawn but never spoken of. Historians debate whether he meant a tunnel or an idea. Either way, the silence has survived longer than any wall. In some fortresses, secrecy had a physical shape. Behind ordinary storerooms were false walls concealing narrow stairways. These led to chambers no larger than closets, their entrances disguised as solid stone. In such rooms, treasures were hidden, gold coins, ledgers, and sometimes the archives of defeated kings. The records show that after wars ended, those who built or guarded these hiding places were often executed to ensure silence. Centuries later, explorers rediscovered some of them by accident. In one fortress near Linz, workers repairing a drainage system uncovered a sealed door. Behind it lay a chamber filled with scrolls so damp they disintegrated upon touch. Among them was a rusted iron chest containing only sand. Someone, long ago, had replaced the treasure with time itself. But not every secret was made of metal or paper. Many were human. During the Wars of Succession, political prisoners vanished into fortresses without record. Official documents mentioned only their arrival, never their departure. These were not public executions, nor acts of justice. They were erasures. In Vienna, an 18th century governor's ledger lists the cost of sustenance for 3 unnamed men over the course of 7 years. The payments end abruptly. No further mention appears anywhere. Historians later found a bricked-up cell matching the description, still holding 3 wooden cups and a chess piece carved from bone. No names, no initials, only the echo of presence. As Europe's wars multiplied, so did its secrets. Fortresses became laboratories for innovation, places where engineers tested new weapons and scholars studied the physics of destruction. Experiments in early explosives, poisons, and communication were often conducted underground, away from spies and the eyes of civilians. The tunnels absorbed their failures. When such experiments went wrong, and they often did, the chambers were sealed, the air vented, and the stone left to heal. Generations later, explorers found scorch marks on ceilings where no torches had ever burned. Some walls still bear outlines of melted iron, warped by heat too intense for candlelight. Official records call these storage accidents. The walls call them something else. Other secrets were personal, fragments of lives that history forgot to erase. Letters hidden behind bricks, love notes folded into cracks of mortar. One found in a fortress in Hungary, dated 1709, reads simply, "If the wind reaches you, know that I am still here." No signature, no reply. Another, discovered in France behind a fireplace stone, contained a child's drawing of a house surrounded by trees. Perhaps a soldier left it there before a battle, a reminder of the world above. The stone kept it safe, long after the hand that drew it was gone. There were darker secrets too. Stories of betrayals carried out under banners of loyalty, of officers who disappeared after victories that cost too much. In a fortress on the Adriatic coast, a sealed corridor was opened in 1932. Inside were two skeletons in faded uniforms, one holding a rusted pistol. The wall around them was marked by bullet holes that faced inward, not outward. Official accounts said the men were enemies. The bones suggested otherwise, perhaps friends who had turned on each other in fear, or who had been buried together to hide the truth. The fortress had kept their story safer than any historian could. Some fortresses tried to bury entire histories. When governments fell, they erased not only names but spaces. Doors were filled with stone, stairways collapsed, floors raised to hide what lay beneath. In Prague, restoration workers once found an entire level of rooms hidden below what was thought to be the lowest floor. The rooms contained nothing but dust and a single table. On the wall above it, someone had written in charcoal, "Forget nothing." The handwriting was hurried, as if the writer knew that forgetting was exactly what the world intended to do. The most haunting secrets are the ones still sealed. In northern Italy, a fortress built in the early 1700s has a section the guides call La Sala Murata, the walled room. Local records mention its existence, but not its purpose. The door is blocked by 5 feet of masonry. Engineers studying the layout say the chamber behind it is large, roughly 10 by 15 meters, but no one has ever opened it. Superstition holds that to break the wall would bring misfortune. The government prefers the legend. It keeps curiosity at bay. So the room remains closed, its contents, whether gold, bones, or only air, unchanged. Time transforms secrecy into mystery, and mystery into fascination. The tourists who walk these halls today marvel at the craftsmanship, the symmetry, the age. Few notice the subtle differences in stone color where one wall is newer than the others. Those lighter blocks often hide something older, something the fortress was instructed to forget. If you press your hand against such a wall, you can feel a faint coolness, as if the air behind it has been waiting for centuries. The fortresses do not speak, but they do breathe. Even the legends they spawned became a kind of camouflage. Tales of buried treasure, of hidden royal heirs, of secret escapes. All of these drew attention away from what was truly hidden: records, memories, guilt. A story of gold is easier to tell than a story of disappearance. In this way, the fortresses protected their creators long after those men were gone. The stones carried silence faithfully, even as the empires that built them crumbled. Modern technology has begun to unearth some of these secrets. Ground-penetrating radar and laser scanning reveal spaces once thought solid. In Germany, a scan of an old bastion revealed a void beneath one of the towers. When archaeologists lowered a camera, they found a perfectly preserved staircase leading to a chamber filled with sealed barrels. Inside each barrel was paper, documents written in a mix of languages, apparently sealed before the Napoleonic Wars. They are still being studied, but early reports suggest they contain lists of spies, confessions, and letters of blackmail never sent. The fortress, as always, had been both jailer and witness. Some secrets, though, will never be opened. Time itself becomes the final lock. Flooding, decay, or deliberate destruction makes certain stories unreachable. And perhaps that is fitting. The fortresses were not built to share truth. They were built to guard it, to keep danger contained whether it came from enemies or from within. The stones have done their duty well. What they hold now is not history, but silence perfected. When the lights are turned off and the last tourists leave, that silence returns. The halls grow darker by degrees, until only the faint glimmer of moonlight seeps through the vents. In that stillness, the air feels almost watchful, as if remembering its old responsibility. The secrets slumber again, untouched, unchanged, their keepers long gone, but their orders still obeyed. No one needs to guard them anymore. The walls themselves have learned how. So much of human effort goes into remembering, yet some of our greatest monuments were built to forget. The fortresses of Europe stand as both memory and erasure, stones that outlasted the reasons for their own secrecy. They teach us that every civilization hides part of itself underground, not only in the literal earth, but in conscience, in silence, in the stories it chooses not to tell. If you visit one of these old strongholds at dusk, walk slowly. Listen to the way your footsteps echo. In that faint returning sound, you can almost hear the whispers of what was meant to stay buried. The names erased from records, the experiments abandoned, the promises broken. The fortresses have not forgotten. They are still keeping their secrets, patiently, until the last stone falls and the earth itself decides that it is time to speak again. Every wall that touches the sky must one day meet the soil again. Time has a slow gravity, and the earth, patient as water, waits for what humans build. Across Europe lie fortresses that once stood proud against invaders and storms, now swallowed by the very ground they guarded. Some sank suddenly, collapsing in war or flood. Others descended slowly, inch by inch, as if the land itself were reclaiming its breath. To walk among their remains is to see how stone, once defiant, learns humility. The earth does not destroy, it simply absorbs. In the beginning, the fortresses rose like mountains of intention. Builders set their foundations deep, believing that depth would protect them. But soil is not still. It shifts, softens, remembers rivers that once flowed beneath. The fortresses did not know that they were built on memory itself. Each passing century pressed more weight upon them. Rain washing mortar into mud, roots prying into cracks, frost lifting stones by fractions until they fell. To the soldiers who once patrolled their ramparts, the ground seemed solid. To the centuries, it was liquid. One of the first to vanish was the fortress of Famagusta's sister stronghold near the Baltic coast, a 17th century bastion built on marshland. Its engineers had drained the soil and laid wooden piles beneath the walls, but the water returned, silent and persistent. By the mid-1800s, entire sections of the fortress had sunk more than 3 meters. Cannons tilted toward the earth like bowed heads. The locals called it the fortress that sleeps. When modern archaeologists surveyed the site, they found its gatehouse half buried in reeds, the top of its arch just visible above the grass. Beneath, the lower rooms remained perfectly intact, their air still cool, their lamps still hanging where they had last been extinguished. The earth had not destroyed the fortress, it had preserved it in silence. There is something tender about how the world reclaims what humans insist on making permanent. The sand of Spain's coast slowly covers the walls of coastal towers once used to spot ships. The dunes shift each year, burying one parapet, uncovering another. The locals mark time not by calendars, but by which tower windows remain visible that season. Children climb the emerging sections as if visiting ruins newly born, unaware that below their feet lies the rest of the fortress, sleeping under centuries of wind. In France, the fortress of Mont Dauphin began to sink soon after completion. The engineers had chosen a plateau they believed unshakable, but the mountain beneath was hollow with limestone caverns. Each spring, water melted through and carried small stones away. The fortress sagged like a tired giant. Attempts to reinforce it only hastened the process. By the 19th century, the inner courtyards had dropped unevenly. stairways ending in walls that once were doors. One soldier wrote in his journal, "The ground swallows us not from anger, but from habit." He was right. The earth was not vengeance, it was patience returning. And yet, when these fortresses sank, they did not vanish entirely. They lingered, half seen, half imagined, on maps and in memory. Farmers plowing fields found bricks surfacing like seashells. Shepherds saw straight lines of stone appearing after rain. The earth, for all its hunger, occasionally gives back pieces of what it eats. In the Netherlands, engineers digging canals uncovered bastions buried beneath peat, their angles still perfect after 300 years. The color of the stone had darkened, but the geometry remained, proof that even in burial, design persists. Not all sinkings were gentle. The fortress of Torunia in Poland met its end in a single night. In 1829, after weeks of heavy rain, the river beneath its foundations swelled and undercut the walls. Witnesses said the fortress seemed to exhale, then folded inward, the central tower sinking first. When dawn came, only the upper edges of its ramparts remained above the water. Fishermen later claimed they could still see windows glimmering below the surface on clear days, like eyes refusing to close. Divers who explored it a century later found the lower chambers filled with silt, but wooden doors still standing upright. Even submerged, the fortress had kept its dignity. There are fortresses that did not sink from water or soil, but from memory itself. When wars ended and borders changed, their names disappeared from maps. Villages grew over them, roads split their walls, and the living forgot that anything had been there. Only the shapes remained, strange rises in the landscape, circular fields that refused to grow certain crops, ridges where snow melted slower than elsewhere. From the sky, they looked like whispers pressed into the ground. Satellites now traced their outlines, revealing ghosts of geometry too perfect to be natural. These are the fortresses that sank into time. In Italy, beneath vineyards and olive groves, lie remnants of small defensive forts from the Renaissance. Their stones have merged with the soil so completely that grapevines grow through old windows. Farmers occasionally dig up cannonballs or fragments of iron gates. They keep them as charms, believing that the earth protects the harvest by feeding on old wars. The irony is poetic. Fruit born from fortifications, sweetness rising where once there was fear. The soil, indifferent to human purpose, knows only cycles. It turns violence into fertility the way it turns autumn leaves into spring soil. The most haunting of all are the fortresses swallowed by mountains. In the Alps, avalanches buried entire structures, locking them beneath snow and stone. Some have never been found. Local legends tell of distant rumblings on quiet nights. Not thunder, but the sound of the buried fortresses shifting under pressure. Shepherds crossing high passes say that on certain mornings, when the snow is thin and the light low, you can see outlines of towers just beneath the ice, like bones under translucent skin. By noon, they vanish again. Whether illusion or truth, it reminds us that the earth keeps its own kind of memory, showing fragments of what it hides only when it chooses. When archaeologists uncover these lost fortresses, they move slowly, as if waking someone from a long sleep. The soil is peeled away layer by layer, revealing stones untouched since the day they sank. Often, objects remain exactly where they fell. A sword leaning against a wall, a cup still resting on a table, a door half open. Time has no wind underground. Everything waits. The first breath of air that enters those spaces after centuries feels alive, carrying the scent of iron and old rain. To stand in such a room is to feel both present and ancient, as if you have interrupted a moment that never truly ended. Some historians believe that fortresses sink not only because of nature, but because of their own design. They were built to resist the outside world, sealing themselves away from change. But what resists change most fiercely becomes heavy with it. Each layer of defense added another layer of weight, pressing down until the ground beneath could bear no more. In that sense, the fortresses collapsed under the gravity of their own pride. The earth, indifferent, simply received them. Resistance became return. Even the sea has its collection of buried strongholds. Along the coasts of Britain and Ireland, fortresses that once guarded harbors now lie underwater, their battlements carpeted with algae, their cannons home to fish. Divers say that descending into them feels like entering a dream. Doorways open into green darkness. Stairways lead upward into nothing. Sunlight filters through the waves, painting moving patterns across ceilings that were meant to be eternal. Down there, the war between man and nature has found its peace. The sea holds no grudges. It turns everything into silence. To think of all these fortresses sunken, buried, drowned, is to realize that permanence was never the point. The builders may have imagined eternity, but the earth had other plans. It accepts every ambition, every wall, every weapon, and turns them into sediment. The sinking is not punishment, it is balance. What rises must one day rest. The fortresses, in their descent, fulfill their purpose, to remind us that strength is only another word for patience. When night falls over these places, the air seems heavier, as if filled with the breath of centuries. Grass grows where ramparts once stood. Birds nest in cracks that were once arrow slits. The fortresses that sank into the earth are not gone. They have simply changed their allegiance. They now defend the quiet instead of the crown. They guard the memory of endurance, showing that even the grandest designs eventually learn to kneel. And if you ever visit one of these places, stand still for a while. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Somewhere below, beneath meters of soil and roots and rain, stones are still aligned in perfect order, arches still hold their weight, and empty corridors wait for a light that will never return. They are not ruins. They are dreams that found their way home. In the end, the earth is the final fortress, and everything else merely its guest. The walls that once stood against it have joined it, and the line between defense and surrender has blurred into peace. The fortresses that sank into the earth remind us that history does not end. It settles, quietly, until all sound fades and all weight is equal again. Every story of stone ends the same way, with silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence that follows a long conversation, when everything that needed to be said has already been spoken. The fortresses of Europe, the tunnels, the walls, the sleeping quarters and hidden chambers have all had their say. They were built to speak of strength, of order, of endurance. Now they whisper only of time. And time, more than any army, has conquered them all. Somewhere, far from cities and rivers, there stands a fortress forgotten by maps. Its stones are pale with age, its gates rusted shut. No banners fly, no footsteps echo within. Moss has become its new guard, wind its only visitor. To the world above, it is ruin. To the earth below, it is memory. This place, the last fortress of silence, exists not in any single country, but in all of them at once, wherever the past has learned to rest. If you walk toward it at dusk, the light softens until the fortress seems to appear out of air itself. The walls are not high, but deep. The stones breathe faintly, as though remembering the hands that placed them. The air smells of iron and rain, the perfume of centuries. Inside, corridors wind without direction, leading to rooms that have forgotten their purpose. You can still see the marks where torches once burned, the scratches of tools left unfinished, the faint outlines of old doors sealed by time. The silence there is not empty. It is dense, layered with the breath of everyone who ever passed through. Listen long enough, and you begin to hear what silence really sounds like. The distant hum of wind through vents, the drip of unseen water, the slow settling of dust. It is not absence. It is a presence so steady that you mistake it for peace. Every fortress, no matter how grand, was built to create this feeling, control, stillness, the illusion that chaos could be kept at bay. But silence was never theirs to command. It waited patiently until the last gate closed, then took possession of the walls as its rightful home. The last fortress has no guards. Only echoes serve watch here. Step carefully, and you will find rooms where the air feels warmer, as if someone has just left. In one, a table still stands with a stone cup resting upon it. In another, a single candle stub clings to its holder, long since melted but not yet forgotten. These small remnants are what silence preserves best: the unfinished gesture, the paused motion, the trace of human presence left midway through a sentence. They remind us that history does not truly end. It pauses, waiting for a listener. It is said that the deeper chambers of this fortress hold no light at all. If you go far enough, the darkness becomes physical, pressing softly against your skin like the weight of water. In that blackness, every sound becomes magnified: your breath, your heartbeat, the rustle of your sleeve. And if you stand still, you might imagine the footsteps of those who once walked there: builders, soldiers, prisoners, messengers, all returning in memory. The walls do not echo them out of haunting, but out of affection. After so many centuries, even sound has learned to move gently here. On certain nights, when the wind comes from the north, the sky above this fortress glows faintly with color. The same auroras that once frightened soldiers now dance quietly overhead, painting the ruins in green and silver. The stones catch the light as though remembering the storms of long ago, when the world thought such beauty was danger. Now, in their solitude, they understand what humans never did: that light and silence belong to the same family. One reveals, the other endures. The last fortress was not built by kings or engineers. It built itself, stone by stone, memory by memory, out of everything left behind. Every vanished stronghold, every buried tunnel, every wall that once stood against time has given a fragment to it. You can feel it when you touch the walls, a faint vibration, like a heartbeat made of centuries. The stones remember the builders who vanished, the soldiers who slept, the prisoners who whispered, the messengers who ran through the dark. All their stories flow together here, blending into one steady rhythm of endurance. If you could listen closely enough, you might hear languages long extinct, laughter buried under dust, the sigh of a candle going out. But the fortress does not speak in words. Its language is the stillness between them, the pause that connects all things. It teaches that silence is not the opposite of sound. It is its completion. Just as the earth completes the sky, the dark completes the light, and endings complete beginnings. To stand within these walls is to understand that history itself breathes, slowly, endlessly, like wind through stone. At the center of the fortress lies a circular chamber, open to the sky. Grass grows between its tiles, and in the middle stands a single column, cracked but upright. No inscription marks it. It needs none. Around its base, the wind gathers dust into soft spirals. Birds land on the edges, then vanish into the air again. This is where the stories converge, the invisible meeting place of every fortress that ever was. If you sit quietly there, you can almost sense them. The ones buried under rivers, the ones shining on hilltops, the ones half hidden in forests. They are all connected by this stillness. The world above may forget, but the foundations remember. In time, even this last fortress will yield. The cracks will widen, the grass will thicken, and the wind will carry its stones back into the soil. But its silence will remain, woven into the earth itself. And that silence will be enough. Because everything built by human hands, from the smallest cottage to the grandest wall, is an act of faith. Faith that memory can resist oblivion, that noise can resist quiet. Yet in the end, it is quiet that survives. Not as victory, but as understanding. If you leave the fortress at night and look back from the hill, you will see nothing extraordinary, just a shape and shadow, a darker gray against the dark. The wind will brush your face, carrying the scent of stone and time. For a moment, you may feel that the fortress is breathing with you, matching your rhythm, reminding you that everything living and everything built share the same fate, to return, one day, to stillness. The story of the fortresses has always been the story of humanity itself. Our desire to stand against time, to protect, to endure. But endurance is not about winning. It is about lasting long enough to be remembered. The tunnels, the chambers, the walls, even the forgotten names, they have all become one long whisper in the archive of the world. And that whisper says, "We were here, we built, we rested, we listened." So let the last fortress keep its watch in peace. Let its stones sink slowly, its echoes fade gently, its silence grow deeper with every passing year. Somewhere beneath the roots and the rain, its memory will hum like a low note, steady and kind. And perhaps, when someone far in the future walks this same ground, they will feel it under their feet, not as ruin, but as presence. The kind of presence that needs no sound to be heard. And that is where our story ends. Not with destruction, not with triumph, but with quiet. The kind of quiet that holds everything inside it. The builder's hands, the soldier's dreams, the prisoner's hopes, the light that once touched the sky. All of it gathered, resting, eternal. The last fortress of silence does not guard against enemies anymore. It guards against forgetting. And in doing so, it becomes what all history longs to be, peace. And so, we leave the walls behind, the stones, the tunnels, the whispers of time. If you've journeyed this far, thank you for walking through history with me tonight. If you felt the quiet, if these forgotten places spoke to you in some small way, leave a comment below. Tell me what part stayed in your mind. Don't forget to like this video if it helped you drift through the calm, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story that time almost forgot. Until then, rest well, dream quietly, and remember, history never truly sleeps.